Tippet Rise Art Center is a place where many arts thrive: poetry, music, architecture, sculpture, and they do so in a natural environment, one that embraces the wilderness and embraces the sky and embraces its local community. So we brought together, with Relevance of Place, artists and designers to help us think about that ambitious mission and what it might mean to carry it forward. This is Relevance of Place. Suzanne, it is so wonderful to have you here at Tippet Rise. It is really special to be able to invite you here. You're an artist who is known for working in the field of community art and socially engaged art, sometimes performance art. I wonder if you could start out by meditating for a bit on that word artist.
I think the basic things that we like about being artists is the freedom to think and explore and make shape and make meaning. You'll see that artists mostly are people that almost have to follow an idiosyncratic vision. And I actually have kind of a dual side to me, because I was trained in science and was going to be a doctor, but I do think a lot like an artist. So what does an artist think like? Well, a visual artist thinks largely in terms of perception. Mm-hmm. And I think you're always sort of seeing and registering how you see, which is interesting at a place like Tippet Rise, because the scale of the environment is just like a constant barrage, in a good way, of your senses. I thought a lot about how do you pair the desire to do whatever you want to do and to express yourself in whatever way you want to with a kind of sense of social responsibility. So for me, that dialectic is always operative. And in my work, I'm really interested in making a potent, affective, often visual experience.
In doing that, though, in trying to have this combination, do you find you have to learn different skills?
Well, analysis first. When I came into art, it was the 70s. So I came in with feminism, I came in with the social justice movements around race, around labor, particularly in California, which was a melting pot of identity politics. And so we being all kinds of artists, began to think about art as a way to express identity and to open up the audience. I think that we as feminists, but as people of color, as working class people, we challenged who was looking. And as soon as you do that, you create the space where the relationality between the work and the viewer is now much more negotiated, much more engaging, and has opportunity for the transmission of ethics and values. So I tend to think in terms of concentric circles of engagement. And concentric circles, and that implies everything from viewing and accepting the canon to participating in making and challenging the canon.
I mean, like you, I feel like I'm somebody who very much appreciates a certain kind of modernist perspective on the arts, that the arts are autonomous in a certain way, and at the same time, I also, perhaps because I came from performance, and I know you're engaged in performance, can't think of the art outside of its context, outside of its conditions of reception, and the way that reception completes the work.
I mean, I watch people's eyes, I watch people's body language. I'm always thinking about the reception of what I'm saying.
The process of engaging with audience and thinking deeply about context seems a very necessary step in order to even get to something like relevance with a capital R.
Well, when they talk about relevance with a capital R, they're ignoring one of the first definitions of relevance, which is relevance to the self. Mm-hmm. And relevance to the self, we observe the world in terms of relevance to ourselves. We want that food, not that food, right? We want to make friends with that person, not that person. So I think the art world has always been relevant to the collectors and relevant to the makers that are accepted. So what is happening now, and I think as a result of a variety of forces, but in terms of my own experience, relevance has shifted to a notion of social relevance.
Yep.
And when I started performance that was socially oriented, politically oriented as a feminist, but also I think for me, I'm interested in aesthetic relevance, which is how does that shape, that color, that movement, that sound relate to the meaning that I'm trying to convey, and not just the affective meaning, but also the socio-political meaning.
And what is wonderful about that last thought is that you're not one to say that a turn to social relevance suddenly means you're not thinking about aesthetics. That it's very much about a reinforcing idea of of how aesthetic choices reinforce what might be
I have
fun.
to say that is a contention that's been around as long as I've been in the art world.
That you have to choose between social relevance and aesthetic form.
Yeah.
Frustrating binary.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the word place with a capital P has resonated or not for you in your own practice, how you see it being utilized, or...
I think place is really critical in social practice, not simply as a concept, as a political, everybody talks about the local and focusing on the local, and I think that's an interesting contrast to one of the ways I think, which is about scale and the national and changing, which you kind of have to think about if you're going to think about social change. But I think that the idea of the place for me, and the reason it's important to social practice, is often as a visual framing. It's a contextual framing for sure, but it's also a visual framing. I'm always looking at the way buildings create a frame, mountains create a frame, valleys create a frame, and I'm drawn toward the aspects of framing that are created by place. And social place has social context. So I think about them in both of those ways.
And it seems to chime with what you said earlier about framing, which I think is another way to think about how place has always been relevant and necessary for any encounter with any artwork. But traditionally, when we think of the frame, we think of the thing around the painting, that this is the frame. And the physical experience, the phenomenological experience of the artwork is this thing inside of a frame. I think part of what sort of the expanded field of art has started to welcome is the sense that that frame is actually on a wall, and that wall is in a room, and that room is in a building, and that building is on a site, and that all of these layers and scales are actually participating in the framing of this artwork, whether or not we're recognizing it. And here at Tippet Rise, you are invited to recognize it. You're invited to recognize how much place and different types of places and contexts structure your experience of the artwork. Which to me is very much part of how so much art, public art, social practice art has forced an expansion.
And it's difficult, the difference between framing in a landscape and framing in an urban environment or framing inside a building is really, really different experiences. But the one thing that really, really resonates is the aha moment. And I remember Katagiri Roshi in Minneapolis talking about that moment when you're walking through the woods and the deer's walking through the woods and all of a sudden you both stop and encounter each other. And he said in that moment, when you look at each other, everything is suspended. Life is suspended. Thoughts are suspended. And then out of that comes maybe an opening, whether that's in the body or the mind or the senses. And in that, and that is, I think, very common experience, particularly in Western cultures, particularly those like me, raised in California, experience this vastness of this place and it's an opening.
What you're describing now in terms of having the privilege of these types of moments and these openings, and about it being from the heart or about affect, that seems to also inform another word that has been really important to you in your practice, relational and relationality. And it seems it's about reciprocity, but it also seems like it's about emotion.
It's about the space between. And the most obvious thing, I thought about that when I first started making art. For me, it's what's this co-construction of action and meaning and so on. And the first thought is relationality is connectivity.
Yeah.
And it could be person to grass to bug. But then when I started thinking more about it and actually reading the definition, it's about connectedness, but it's relational thinking.
Yes.
It's kind of thinking of how does that link to that, to that, to that.
Almost ecological, actually. And it seems that a lot of your art projects are about trying to reckon with this wild thing of what it is to share life together. Going back to having, previously talked about relationality and what it is to go into places without preconceived notions and preconceived ideas about how people are supposed to think. Maybe you could describe a couple of commissions there and how you entered, what issues came up, how you navigated the scale of these commissions and these sites.
Well, I'll talk first about working with super slow waves, in situ, and...
Can you say what Super Slow Ways is?
Super Slow Ways is a commissioning agency in northwest England, in the Pendle. It's a mill area that's been deindustrialized and is subsequently quite poor. And in that community, people who populated and worked in the mills were white people from who grew up in England and Pakistani immigrants in the 50s and 60s. They came because they had skill sets in textiles, so they worked in these textile mills. The community during that time was certainly separated but lived and worked together for 8 to 10 hours a day.
Right.
So while prejudice existed, there was the recognition that these people had come here to work.
And that because the labor is something that everyone needs, it actually becomes a reason that people can occupy space together.
Exactly. So that then, years later, in the late 80s and 90s, when the place, when textile fabrication moved to other countries where labor was cheaper, this area didn't have a labor base. And one of the things that happened in the region is that the cultures grew apart, because if you're a Muslim, you don't go to pubs, don't go to the same churches. You show up in Asda, their Walmart, you show up there together, and that's it. You tangentially touch on each other. So as this separation occurred, also terrorism grew up, and there was more and more fear, more and more kind of separation and more foreignness of Pakistani immigration, and Indian, but mostly Pakistani. And so I entered that environment, and it was a rich environment for me in terms of problems. So the problems, I tend to work in terms of problem solving. And so it's a little bit design-oriented, a little bit art-oriented. When presented with the problem of this really increasing poverty was what I was really interested in, and racism, which has been a consistent theme since I was at least 10, if not before. I challenged a small community art organization that we knew we wanted to do something in the mill. And I challenged them that we would do something of scale in the mill, and that because this town and Lancashire area is almost 50% Muslim, I said, of course, that means we have to have 50% Muslims. The community, and I said, and if we're going to do 1,000 people in order to occupy the scale of the mill, then, and the community organizer was sort of like, oh my God, how do I deal with this? Let's do a dinner. Everybody loves dinners. And I challenge you to do 100 people, 50% of whom are Pakistani. And the guy did. And we needed a metaphor. And I had always been interested in shape note music.
Can you describe that?
Shape note is people sit in a square, and each square has a designated tonal quality. And so they all open their pages and they sing their lungs out. And it's such a compelling sound to me. And anybody can participate. It's highly democratic. It's very rural in its practice. And I brought a friend of mine from Kentucky who was an expert, and he began to work with local people to reinvigorate what had actually started there. And there is a British shape note community. In the meantime, we had made friends with a particular Sufi group who was very open to engaging cross-culturally, and they even had already been doing chanting circles where they would invite the white folk in to learn how to chant. And so we used the circle and the square, those two forms, and they learned each other's, the people we participated with. So there was a lot of fusion, but you have to be very careful because Sufis don't sing, they chant, and there's all kinds of cultural things you have to understand. But as we worked together over time and made bigger and bigger groups, we ended up with 500 people at dinner. We ended up with a 3-day performance and incredible film that came out of it.
In this situation where deindustrialization is also contributing to increased prejudice, and increased poverty, of course, is contributing to increased racism, okay? And that you could have come into that community with your flags waving, with your pedagogy about how everybody needs to understand structural racism and everybody needs to understand deindustrialization, and from there we're going to learn about each other. No, it would have not have worked.
That's not social practice, though. That's political analysis.
Right.
And good, but
yeah,
it's
it
not
has its
social
place.
practice.
It has its place. Whereas instead, you're coming at this community, entering this community, and figuring out what kind of aesthetic forms might provide a different way for people to share space together.
The thing that I think where we came together, and if you look closely at the two musical forms, they're ecstatic forms. And they are forms that do have an opening. And shape note, it's really interesting. They sit in a square and they sing like this, but they move their hands, they rock their bodies this way. And Sufis focus this way, sit in a circle, and they move this way. So but in both cases, they come together on nature. And now those Sufi guys who culturally did not inhabit the Lancashire Hills are now going out every Sunday on treks across England. And it has to do with their belief fundamentally, we believed in the spiritual connection through nature and environment and worship.
All right, let's head over to Patrick Doherty's Daydreams.
I think about how people will see it. I think a lot about different ways of seeing and different perspectives people bring to something. In my own work, I try to address simultaneously an art constituency that's pretty sophisticated about performative works, installation works, and the change of works over time. But I also think about how people on the street will read it. And so a lot of times I use subject matter as a read for a broader culture, and then the architecture of the work, the concept of the work, and how it relates to the history of performance art becomes something that I talk to the art world about.
So what about the fact that this sculpture is mimicking a frontier schoolroom?
Well, it's really interesting. The fact that it's pedagogic is what we call it now. That means educational in nature. Then I would not only bring schoolhouse and my childhood and experiences in the South in one-room schoolhouses, I would bring that association to it. But I would also bring more of a social practice association, which is this object teaches.
Yeah.
And it will teach us differently depending on who we are. Basically, when I go there, and I'm sure when children and families go there, they think about play.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think there are other ways to think about it. The sort of intrusion of nature into culture,
Yeah.
of course, is pretty obvious. But what I really like about it is the movement in the work. I think that the ways in which things come in and out are sort of fanciful and fascinating, and definitely fascinating for kids. For me, art inevitably teaches something.
And which is also always for me what's so interesting about genuinely interesting public art, that you might think that you understand where the art ends and the rest of the world begins. And in fact, the most interesting art is something that invites a much wider world at ever wider scales. And this seems to me in some ways a metaphor for sort of, the real difficulty of deciding where the inside and outside is of any art piece.
To me, one of the things that the essential strategies that differs from most artists is that you also have to understand how to negotiate and how to listen. How to listen to people, because you are essentially trying to create a work that operates within your own fantasy, within your own imaginary, and you need to invite them into it. So that when I work on a piece maybe for a year, people I know, you can see the point where they start understanding the image, and you can then, that they're all different visions. Inside of every head, there's a different vision, and my job is to align visions as we move forward so that on the day of the event or the performance, we're all thinking alike.